What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the show. So today I want to talk about executive orders. So I had a few people in the comments ask me about an executive order. Can't President Biden just sign an executive order for stimulus checks? And so I want to talk a little bit about this. Representative Jayapal, just a couple of days ago, she spoke out about executive orders, basically asking the president, calling on the president to offer up some executive orders. So when it comes to the Build Back Better plan, there are certain things that President Biden could use executive order to get passed. And so she was asking him to do that. And so I want to talk a little bit about this when it comes to stimulus checks, because I have a lot of people that are under the impression that President Biden can do that. So let's discuss that. But first off, on this channel, we talk about financial news and more. If that sounds like something interesting to you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell notification. That way you'll get notified anytime we put out a video. And like always, if you see my name and a picture of me in the comment section, make sure you also see a check mark next to my name. That check mark signifies that it's me. If you do not see that check mark, it's not me. It's someone trying to impersonate me. Okay, so let's talk about this whole executive order talk, because when it comes down to it, when it comes to presidents signing executive orders, there's a reason why presidents they have the power to do this executive order. And that's for emergency situations. Now, when we're looking at the executive order in this situation, we have to understand there's a balance of power. Okay, so you have the executive, the legislative, the judicial branch. And so they all have separate power. They all have different powers. And the reason that our founding fathers decided to make it like this is because they didn't want to have a president that has too much power, or the legislative branch, Congress, having too much power, or the judicial branch, the judges, the Supreme Court, having too much power. And so they spread it out among all the different branches. And so when it comes to the president has a lot of power, but the purse, the power, the money, that comes from Congress. And will always come from Congress. And because of that, the president can't just sign executive orders if there's no money that's already been attached to it. And so we did see an executive order from President Trump, and this was in 2020. Okay, and that was for the enhanced unemployment. I don't know if you guys remember that, but it was a $300. He extended that. And that was an executive order. And so when President Trump did that, there was some controversy because of the money, right? Because Congress needs to approve something like that. Because if you're extending something, the enhanced unemployment, extending that $300 per week, the money has to come from somewhere. And so what President Trump did is he went into disaster relief and he took $44 billion from that, from FEMA. Now, that's a big issue, okay? That's a big deal, because if we were to have had anything serious that would happen at that time, that disaster relief money would be gone. And then they would have to figure out how they're going to get the money, and then they would have to ultimately go to Congress to find out if they can get more money when it comes down to the disaster relief. And so that became very controversial. Now, let's look at stimulus checks, okay? Let's look at stimulus checks now. Let's say President Biden said, you know what, I want to send out stimulus checks to the American people, and I'm going to do it through executive order. If he were to do that now, first off, he doesn't have money, okay? So if we're talking about disaster relief, let's say there's $50 billion, or let's say there's $100 billion in disaster relief. Well, he would have to do the same thing, executive order, stimulus checks, and then take that money from an emergency fund. And if there was an emergency, well, then obviously we'd be in the same situation where there would be no money there. And so then they would have to scramble to try to figure out how to put money back into an emergency fund. And so looking at stimulus checks, we know from the history of stimulus checks that have been going out, it's roughly about $400 billion to send out stimulus checks to the same people that received them before. Okay, now let's say they wanted to do it more targeted. So let's say it's only half the people that received it last time would receive it this time. So we're talking about $200 billion. So the president would sign an executive order, take $200 billion from emergency funds, and then use that money for stimulus checks. That's the only way that we can do it. And I don't think that would be possible at the present time. I don't think there's enough emergency fund money in order to do that. Now, there is leftover money from past stimulus packages. Okay, so people have asked about that. Well, there's money there. Why can't he just use that money? Well, he doesn't have the authority to just use that money. That money has to be sent by Congress. So Congress would have to determine, the money would have to come back to Congress. Congress would have to determine, okay, this is where the money is going to go. And then the money goes to where the president would want it. Let's say if he does want it to go for stimulus checks. But it would be the same situation where Congress is going to have to vote on it and then release the money. And so what we're looking at is Congress needs to act. And earlier this year, the president, or Jen Psaki, speaking on behalf of the president, there was a question asked about stimulus checks, and she said it's going to be up to Congress. So at the current time, if we were to see another stimulus check, it's going to have to come from Congress. It's not going to be coming from the president. It's not going to be an executive order. There's no money for it. There's no money that the president has access to in order to make that happen. And so I just wanted to address that because that's something that people have been asking me in the comments. And some people have been telling me, no, he can do an executive order for stimulus checks. No, he can't. If there's no money there, he can't do that executive order. And the amount of money that we're looking at right now that would be in an emergency fund is not going to be enough money to send out stimulus checks. And then if you deplete that emergency fund, now you're in a situation where if there is an emergency that happens, it's going to be a bad situation because there's going to be no money. And then you're going to have Congress bickering over, okay, well, there's no money. How are we going to vote to add more money? He spent this money. It would be a disaster. Okay. The part of the reason too, part of the reason why the president has access to emergency fund money is because we don't want to go through an emergency, a flood or a natural disaster, and then have to wait on Congress to vote and approve new money because we know how long it takes Congress to do anything. So we don't want to be in a situation where we're waiting on Congress to release funds so the money can go to the flood victims. No, we want to have money in an emergency fund. So if there's a situation that happens like this, then the president can use that executive order and send that money out the next day instead of waiting for weeks, months, maybe even 6 months for money to come from Congress. And so that's what it was designed for, the executive action. It's not one of those situations where executive action is used instead of legislation. Okay, so I know Representative Jayapal wants to do that now. She wants to use it instead of legislation. Let's go ahead and use executive order. But it wasn't initially designed for that. And this is, in my opinion, this is a situation where Congress need to come together. They need to come together and pass this Build Back Better bill. And she shouldn't be at this point pushing on the president to do executive order because they can't get along themselves and pass a bill. And I know you're saying, well, didn't President Biden just sign an executive order to extend the student loan moratorium? And yes, he did. But there was no money attached to that because all you're doing is putting it on pause. All those people who have those student loans and owe the student loans, they're still going to have to pay them in full. It's just kicking the can down the road as politicians like to do. And that's all he's doing. So he's not adding new money in. All he's doing is pausing or extending that pause for student loans. So it's a different situation there. So he can do an executive order for things like that. But when it comes to an executive order where you need new money coming in, that's when you're going to have to go through Congress. Now, I know it's frustrating, but even in Build Back Better, they didn't even add anything when it comes to a stimulus check in there. So it's highly unlikely that we're going to see anything in the near future when it comes to a stimulus check. But I've talked about this in a previous video, so I want you guys to check that video out. I'll post a link at the end of this video. But I was talking a little bit about the whole stimulus check name. They should change that name. It should be a tax cut. That's what we should be talking about. A tax cut for the American people, because that's what a stimulus check is. A stimulus check is a tax credit that was advanced to you early. That's where we should be focused on. That's what we should be talking about, because tax cuts, tax credits are very popular among everyone. Even politicians like to hear about tax credits and tax cuts. That's what we should be calling this. Just like the child tax credit, we should be calling this a tax credit. And one more thing, when it comes to tax credits, because I did have someone ask me this question too in the comments, or make a statement saying that a tax credit doesn't do anything for me. I don't pay taxes. I'm on a fixed income. And the stimulus check was a tax credit. Okay, it was a tax cut. It was a tax credit. That's what it was. And that's why, if you remember, some people who didn't file taxes had to go to the IRS portal and put in additional information so they can send the checks out to you. That's the reason. So even if it's a tax credit or a tax cut, it's the same thing. You would still receive it even if you're not paying taxes. Okay, so I just wanted to make that clear, because some people thought, well, stimulus check is one thing, a tax credit is a different thing. They were the same thing. They were advancing that money to you early, and if you wanted to collect that $1,400 or the $1,200 or the $600, you needed to put that information into the IRS, and then they were sending that out to you. So that's how that all worked out. So even if it's a tax credit or a tax cut, you would still be able to get that tax cut, but you might need to put in additional information to the IRS in order to receive it, just like we did with stimulus checks. So that's my thought when it comes down to it. When it comes to an executive order, that's something that would be very, very tricky, very, very hard for the president to do when it comes to stimulus checks. I want to know what you guys think down below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe for more, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Bye.